All right, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of In Liberty and Health. Today's guest is a returning guest who's been on the show, I think, 4 or 5 times. And every time, as usual, with all the guys from the Libertarian Institute, I always learn quite a bit. And I always find myself listening to the shows again because there's just so much information that, either wasn't aware of or I kind of need to brush up on. And I'm sure the show will be absolutely no exception because I've definitely told people before that Syria is probably not one of my strong suits, but it always seems to be a pretty big thing in the whole kind of foreign policy realm. And obviously, lately, there's been a lot going on in both Syria and South Korea. So we're going to cover that today. And I'm sure we'll probably dive in on some other topics as well. But as far as all that stuff's concerned, make sure you hit all the links below to find where my guest is, everything he's got going on. In particular, Libertarian Institute. I don't know if they're still doing a fundraiser, but regardless, you should check out all the stuff over there. Anyways, and antiwar.com. Make sure you hit all the links below for everything I got going on. Common Crown's going to be playing in 9 days out in Akron if you're listening to this live, or December 14th. So if you're in the Akron area, feel free to come out and check us out. Like I said last night, there are going to be a few people on Twitter and the Twitterverse that I've kind of been on their show. They've been on my show. And, they're going to be coming out to see me. So that's pretty cool. So look forward to that. Tucker Fitness through the link below. Like I said yesterday, no Black Friday sales or Cyber Monday sales anymore, but you should still go there and get all the supplements that make you all jacked and tan, deemed fit through the link below. And Fox and Sons Coffee, use code Kyle at checkout. So with all that shilling out of the way, let's enjoy our conversation today with my guest, Kyle Anzalone, and we'll cover all things Syria and South Korea. In returning to the show, my dear friend Kyle Anzalone, how you doing, man?
Doing well, Kyle. Happy to be back. Always a good time to talk with you.
Yeah, absolutely. So anyways, there's a whole lot going on in the news. It seems like everything that kind of went on in South Korea was kind of like here and gone, but I still feel like it's kind of relevant. And then obviously Syria was in the news a lot recently. So if you want to start on either one of those, I'll let you pick and then we'll kind of go from there.
Oh boy, I want to start at both. Let's start with North Korea though, because I think it's actually probably the shorter of the two that we have to cover, and
Sure.
maybe actually is going to have more of a consequence on the incoming Trump administration.
Sure.
So South Korea, their government is different than the United States, but somewhat similar in that they have a presidential election, and then they also have a separate legislator that is, and they have something similar in that they have like a midterm election, right?
Mhm.
And so earlier, I guess the best way to start this story is in 2022, Yoon Suk Yeol won a very, very close, the closest ever presidential election in South Korea. I think by either like less than a percentage point is what he won the vote by. And so he barely wins the presidency. He comes into office, and one of the things that he does in particular is he moves South Korea closer to the United States militarily, and also importantly, he moves South Korea towards Japan uh militarily, and this is really important in South Korea. World War II isn't that long ago, and Imperial Japan ruled Korea, and the men were taken away to work as slaves, like in work camps. The women were taken away and were known as comfort women, basically made sex slaves. And there's a lot of historical injustice there that the people of South Korea and the people of North Korea feel that the Japanese have not atoned for, and that there's a lot of still living victims, like fewer and fewer every year, of course, but as of 10, 15 years ago, there were still a lot of living victims in Korea of
Mhm.
Imperial Japan. And so shifting the country towards Japan, I think is probably a pretty big deal in South Korea. Now, just like in the US, policy and how popular a president is doesn't have everything to do with foreign policy, right? A lot of it has to do with domestic policy. And on the home front, I think He's probably, from my understanding, really cracked down on things like trade unions and labor. And you know, from some aspects, he's gone too far. And then there's also a scandal involving his wife, where it seems pretty clear that she was doing some insider trading. It seems pretty clear that other people who were involved in that insider trading were, you know, punished legally for it. I don't know. I'm not familiar enough with the Korean justice system to say they received fair punishments, or I have no idea. But, you know, again, she wasn't punished, the wife of the president. Other people were. And then she also accepted a $2,000, I believe, handbag, which, again, American politicians, yeah, they'll take $5,000 from APAC on a Tuesday, right? Like, that's not a big deal.
That's a day that ends in Y.
Trump took $100 million from Maria Madelson, but in South Korea, this is unheard of. And now there's something else really important to understand about South Korea. If you look at the list of previous presidents and you skip the most recent president, there's a long list of presidents who have committed suicide, end up in jail, or been murdered. And so I was talking to somebody who's, you know, familiar with the Korean language, and said there's an expression in Korea that, you know, if you wish somebody's son to become the president, you're actually wishing that, like, them ill will. And so it's not necessarily like, you know, in the United States, right? Nobody thinks like, oh, being president is going to work out bad for Barack Obama, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, right? Like, all these people have lived better lives after their presidency. But that's not necessarily the case in South Korea. And so, anyways, with all that going on, we have elections earlier this year in April, and the opposition party, the South Korean Democratic Party, no, you know, actual physical relation to the Democrat Party of the United States, won the election, and not by like an overwhelming number. I think there's about 300 seats in the South Korean legislature, and they won 180 of them. The party of the president, I think it's the People's Power Party, the PPP, they won just over 100 seats. And so then there's other parties that have smaller percentages. And I think at least some of them tend to kind of, I don't know, caucus with or vote alongside the Democratic Party. So there's a pretty steep majority in favor of the opposition to Yoon. And so the Democratic Party has essentially done what I think most American voters of the opposition party would love for it to happen if their party won the midterm elections, right? So imagine in 2022, the Republicans win the midterm elections, or in 2026, the Democrats do. Well, had the Republicans won in 2022 and they started, they kicked Fauci out of the Biden administration. They actually cut the funding for the war in Ukraine. They cut the funding for the IRS. Well, this is essentially what the Democratic Party was doing. They were making it difficult for Yoon to govern. He was unpopular. He was caught up in a corruption scandal, and he saw the list of his predecessors. And so I think Yoon got really nervous, and I think that was on December 3rd, either the 2nd or 3rd, at about 10:30 at night. Yoon declared martial law in South Korea, and this was, I think, within 6 hours, at about 4:30 a.m., it was ultimately rescinded. And so for these 6 hours, you have a lot of chaos. It doesn't seem like this was very well coordinated, and that's because you have like police officers in the streets calling their commanding officers, basically asking how to handle this. You had CNN like actively talking on air with their reporters in South Korea going, you know, it says that there's supposed to be a commission to oversee media now. Are we supposed to be like, they're literally puzzling through the martial law order on air. And then also you had this incident at the South Korean parliamentary building where when the president declares martial law in South Korea, if I think it's a majority, I'm pretty sure it's a majority of lawmakers get together and they vote against or for the martial law, then that's the status of it, right? And so the at least portions of the South Korean media military is immediately deployed to the parliamentary building. Again, this is why I think it's ill coordinated, right? Like if you're Yoon, you had the parliamentary building like sealed up with your most loyal soldiers before you issue the martial law order, but he didn't do that. And so there's parliamentary aides in the building, and they are able to apparently stop the military from actually entering the legislative chambers with setting up barricades made of like wood and just things you would find around a congressional building, and fire extinguishers by spraying fire extinguishers. And so, that kind of tells us two things. One, the South Korean military, or at least whoever was deployed to that building, really wasn't interested in upholding the martial law order, or they would have done what police officers or military do in martial law, and that is open fire on people who are disobeying. And they simply didn't do that.
Right.
And so the legislator voted, I believe it was 190 to nothing, and 18 or 20, not a small number, but a number of the PPP, Yoon's own party, actually voted against his martial law order. And so then it was taken down. Now, going forward, Kyle, I guess, do you have any questions? I guess I should, give you a second.
No, that's okay. Yeah. So it kind of sounds like, it's so funny because there's almost like a through line with a lot of like the US allies. Like BB is in a lot of hot water, so conveniently a war breaks out, or he just conveniently ignores a lot of information that could have potentially stopped October 7th. I know it was over in Taiwan. The Democratic People's Party had won recently as well. And I think it was kind of a similar deal, if I remember correctly. Like they didn't completely beat out the Kuomintang, but they did beat them. And even after the Kuomintang had sided with another like third party, and they kind of came together to try and beat the DPP, but the DPP still won. I just kind of see these through lines. And also, I guess maybe we can get to this after kind of this whole thing's laid out, but it just kind of seems like, every single time one of the more like US minded leaders kind of get in some hot water, they tend to like to stir up some controversy to make sure that everything kind of stays good on their grounds. But maybe after we're kind of done walking through this, I kind of wanted to maybe put a little bow tie on the Biden administration's actions surrounding South Korea and how that contributes to the greater foreign policy and what a Trump administration will look like going forward. So basically,
That's exactly what I want to get to. And I just want to make sure I didn't need to like hit on any background to make all this made sense. The next point I'm making. And so the South Korea was supposed to hold a presidential election in 2027, which was going to be very problematic because Yoon has really embraced this policy of increased militarism, with Washington, which makes talks with North Korea impossible. And if you look at, and so I've actually had a debate with a friend of mine a little bit about this, as far as how much we could credit the previous South Korean president, Moon Jae-in, who was the president in South Korea during the bulk of Trump's term from 2017 until 2022. He gets for facilitating the diplomacy between Kim and Trump, but he certainly was interested in going down that path towards diplomacy with North Korea, where the current South Korean administration isn't. So if Trump
he was in the opposition party. I'm sorry to interrupt, but he was in the other party, not
the Democratic Party. Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Right. Yeah. And so, anyways, I guess if we look at this, though, if Trump comes into office, even if he wants to get a deal done with Kim, he was going to have a major barrier in Seoul, in Yoon, until at least 2027. And then you have South Korean elections, and maybe you get somebody more favorable, maybe you don't. So now it seems almost certainly that Yoon is going to be impeached. And South Korea isn't the US in that there's a vice president that's next man up. They hold, I think the prime minister effectively takes over the government and caretaker's role, and then they hold elections within 60 days. And that's actually how Moon Jae-in got elected the first time. The previous president, Park, who was the daughter of a former military dictator of South Korea, was arrested on what seemed to me, reading from it and what to expect from American politicians, some relatively low-level bribery crimes. And so with her being arrested, it really ushered in a sweeping kind of mandate for Moon Jae-in, and he was able to accomplish a lot on the diplomatic front with North Korea. And so now, and this kind of plays out very similar, and we ran an article at antiwar.com by a libertarian, Joseph D. Terwilliger, and Joe is actually served as Dennis Rodman's translator in North Korea. So he personally knows Kim Jong-un. He taught at the Pyongyang, I think it's like Science and Technology University, for several years until Trump made it illegal for Americans to travel to North Korea. And so that shut down that program. He's a professor of genetics at Columbia University. I mean, this guy's incredibly smart. And
He'll be on the show next week. I already talked to him. So
oh, fantastic! All right, that's awesome. Yeah, you're going to love talking with Joe, and like talk. Of course, his stories about North Korea are fantastic, but
sure.
the guy knows about so much more, about the world and everything than North Korea. So, so where was I going with this?
Basically, where
Oh yeah,
how it
so
kind
the
of looks
article that
for
he
being
wrote.
impeached. Yeah.
Yeah. So the article he wrote for antiwar.com earlier this
Oh, yeah.
week, he explained that it actually timed out very similarly to what happened in 2016, where Park gets removed in the fall, Moon gets elected in the spring, and so Moon and Trump are kind of coming into office at the same time.
Okay.
Now, I don't
Yeah.
think it's going to be Moon Jae-in, but it is going to be somebody within the Democratic Party that ultimately wins the next South Korean presidential election, and that person is going to be more just based on the party politics, we're likely going to see somebody who's far more interested in regional stability and not being tied in with American militarism. Also, some more South Korean independence. It's important to know that there's, I believe, a 4-star U.S. general stationed in South Korea. And if war breaks out on the Korean Peninsula, that man is actually in charge of the combined American and South Korean forces.
Oh, wow.
And so, that's a lot of sovereignty to give up if you really think about it. Imagine if the United States went to war and then whoever the Secretary General or the top general in NATO became the effective commander in chief of the American military. That would obviously be a huge give up in American sovereignty. And that's, something
Right.
that South Korea has given up. And so I think there's a real opportunity here for diplomacy and headway to be made with the North Koreans. Now, there is a question: is it too late? Because Biden has really made a mess of things when it comes to North Korea. Not only did he do the kinds of things that Barack Obama and his predecessors were doing, the war games on the Korean Peninsula, including drills that simulate the decapitation of Kim Jong-un. We're talking about deploying a nuclear armed submarine to the Korean Peninsula. That had been done since the 1980s, but the B-52s, these other provocative things the U.S. does fairly common. But the one major provocation that I think is unlikely to be unwound is moving Seoul, Washington, and Tokyo into a trilateral military pact. And they're carrying out common war games now. And I just don't think that's something that's going to be undone by Trump, because in Washington, this isn't about Pyongyang. This is really important. It's all about Beijing, right? Like they don't consider Kim Jong-un when they're making these decisions. And of course, that's absurdly stupid, but our leaders in Washington are absurdly stupid. And so they've really ratcheted the tensions up with Pyongyang and and they try to isolate Putin at the same time. And so it created this situation where North Korea shares a border with Russia, and suddenly you've tried to isolate these two countries, and they say, you need artillery shells, and I have a lot of artillery shells. We need commerce and technology, and you have a lot of commerce and technology. Let's sign a deal. And so now Moscow and Pyongyang, it was actually made official today, have an effective mutual defense pact. And to some degree, there seems to be some number of North Koreans that are doing something in Russia, somehow supporting the war effort. If you ask an American official, a NATO official, or if you ask Zelensky, the North Koreans are actively fighting on the front line.
Yeah, I remember hearing about this. They said some people were saying as high as 100,000 North Korean troops were in Russia, but I also seen some articles that said like 5,000, some that said like 10,000. Nobody really seems to know what the number actually is.
which suggests that it's pretty small. If it was really large, there would be, there would be some more evidence of it.
Sure.
Now, it does seem that the North Koreans, wherever they are operating, it is in Russian territory, or at least the Donbass or something like this. There's some reports that they're fighting in Kursk. This may be true. There is, to an extent, no replacement for getting actual battlefield experience for your troops, particularly because it's battlefield experience against the same enemy that you would be fighting against should war break out on the Korean Peninsula. It's NATO, right? Like the tactics aren't going to be that much different from the South Koreans versus the Ukrainian trained, armed, funded, NATO trained and armed and funded Ukrainian army. So, I think the North Koreans may see some advantage there. I'm sure a portion of it is North Korea has sent Russia artillery systems and artillery shells. I'm not sure what if there's any overlap from like the Soviet era between Russian and North Korean military equipment, but I guess it's different enough that it's helpful to have at least some North Koreans there for logistical, technical maintenance and repair support. So if something gets broken, something breaks down, something's not working, you have a North Korean there who's familiar with the system, who's trained on the system, who's able to provide the Russians with help. And then, there may be some other things too, where North Korean troops are sitting in Russian command centers, just getting information, right? Like, this is how the Americans fight, and it's beneficial to them. So, and I'm sure behind the scenes, North Korea is getting their hands on some Russian military technology, and maybe we'll find out about that one day, and maybe it'll just be more covert. But with this going on, if Kim is looking to make a deal with Trump, then Trump almost has to end the war in Ukraine first. And short of that, Trump has to offer Kim something worthy of him turning away from Moscow. Now, I think there's reasons that Pyongyang would do this. If you look at the history between the Soviet Union and North Korea, the North Koreans felt like they got shafted a lot. And whether that's true or not, history could debate it, but I do think that's a somewhat prevalent feeling in Pyongyang. And so if you have that feeling, maybe there still is room to drive a wedge in that relationship. But Trump has to come in and be willing to offer North Koreans something substantial and meaningful. It'd probably start with an official end to the Korean War. Right now, it's under an armistice. Making an official end to the war, how much of a difference does that make? Like, actually what's going on the ground? Probably none, but ceremony, it's a big deal. Also, you could kind of claim that you made a major breakthrough, and when nothing bad happens, then you could start to like implement actual deals that may be smaller but are actually far more significant. So, something that Joe advocates for is having more overlap between the American and North Korean university system. So he would go back to teaching in North Korea, just allowing Americans of any kind, Dennis Rodman and other NBA players to show back up in Pyongyang. One of the stories that Joe told me that I think is so important to the U.S. North Korean relationship and understanding it is Dennis Rodman, I think it was in 2017, went to Pyongyang with some NBA players, and Joe was there, and they played a game of basketball on Kim's birthday and everything like that. And Kim told Joe that was the first time that an American had ever kept their promise to a North Korean. And look, this is back to the old Ron Paul idea of sports diplomacy, that, playing baseball with the Cubans and playing hockey with the Russians or the Soviets. These are ways, to break down the barriers of hatred that lead to war and sanctions and all these other negative things that, I advocate against. And so, these steps would seem minor, but could be really important. Ultimately, I don't think North Korea agrees to denuclearization, but I think North Korea would certainly agree to limits, inspections, and, stop testing so many missiles, developing their nuclear program. Like, these things can be curtailed if Trump is willing to take particularly sanctions off the table, which would mean probably getting rid of the UN sanctions on North Korea, which actually, from North Korea's standpoint, may be a real win, because people say, oh, the US could just stick sanctions back on any time, which is true, but not the UN sanctions. And if Kim has at least not a friend, but somebody who isn't going to screw him in Moscow. Well, Russia holds a veto on the UN Security Council. And so that means the UN really can't re-sanction North Korea without at least, the Russian passive permission to do so. And so sanctions relief could be really big for the North Koreans at this point, and maybe something that they're willing to give up a lot to get. And so, I think a deal is really possible here. I think that Yoon made a blunder, and I'm very happy that nobody in South Korea, it seems, got really hurt. There wasn't a bump to death in the streets or anything from like that, and it seems to have presented a real good political opportunity from the perspective of an American who wants to see a de-escalation of tensions on the Korean Peninsula.
Hmm. Yeah, I would hope that Trump would kind of feel like he could come in and talk with Kim Jong Un again. Be like, hey, I understand that that last guy, Biden, did a lot to kind of, piss you off, but hopefully we can kind of come in here and cool things over because this is something else that I kind of wanted to mention in there on top of all the stuff, the war games, the nuclear submarines in South Korea and stuff like that that Biden did is also Japan also playing a part in this whole pivot to Asia where they're trying to double Japan's military budget, obviously, like B-52 bombers to Australia and stuff like that, which like not all this stuff directly affects North Korea, but I'm sure they're feeling the heat a little bit when all of Washington is saying China, 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 and then they're also like, oh yeah, we're looking at you, North Korea, don't get too cocky either because we're not scared of you either. I think
Well, I
hopefully.
think I would just say I think it maybe impacts North Korea a little bit more. I
Okay,
mean, if you look at the power disparity between the United States and China,
sure.
it's relatively similar. If you look at the power
Yeah,
disparity between the United States and North Korea, it's absolutely massive. And
sure.
so, a nuclear armed U.S. submarine showing up in Okinawa or the Philippines or in
Yeah.
South Korea to China, they're not worried about that because that doesn't present like a real threat to China that already doesn't exist. But to North Korea, that could be, a signal for a preemptive attack on North Korea. And the US can't just take out China in a nuclear first
Right.
strike, right? Like
Mhm.
China's a massive country with a large military. They have a lot of partners, and influence around the world. That won't work with China. With
Mhm.
North Korea, I think North Korea senses that that's something that they could actually be vulnerable to. And
Mhm.
so, again, while this is all directed at Beijing, that's all they think about when they're plotting this out in the State Department, the Pentagon, the Oval Office. In reality, it has a far bigger impact on North Korea than it does on China,
Mhm.
even though that's not what the US is considering when they make these policies.
Right. Yeah, okay, yeah, actually, I think that, makes more sense of what I was saying, yeah, but like I said, with the Biden administration, they just real there's been no signs of diplomacy on the table. So, when it comes to kinda Russia and North Korea then, I think a lot of people always jump to World War III right away, and it definitely seems like we're kinda on that path, but you would know this better than me, I don't think it's quite so clear that if let's say the US goes to war with Russia tomorrow, which at this rate, who knows, but like I don't think it's always evident that like Iran's going to step in, North Korea's going to step in, China's going to step in. Like these countries have like alliances, but they're not like NATO alliances or like AUKUS where like or US and the Philippines where we gave a war guarantee to the Philippines. Do you think that North Korea, Russia, Iran, China have like like they're that tight? To me, like I said, it doesn't seem like that's a straight up guaranteed thing, but like I said, you would probably know better than me.
No, I think it's a little bit, as you're saying, I think a little bit more practical than philosophical
Right.
or something that just you know Israel is our greatest ally, right? Like we just give Israel whatever
Everybody will
they
say
want.
that, yeah.
The NATO alliance is an unshakable institution. I
Yeah.
don't think Moscow feels that way about their partnership with Tehran, with Pyongyang, or even with Beijing. I don't think Beijing feels that way, certainly about Pyongyang, certainly about Tehran, maybe a little bit about Moscow. But I think generally speaking, these countries' alliances and relationships with each other are far more out of the circumstance that the Americans have created, right? Like
Right.
John Bolton has, the ultimate self-fulfilling negative prophecy here, right?
Yeah.
Where, he envisioned this ultimate axis of evil coming against the United States. And so he's constantly provoking for wars against Iran, North Korea, Russia, and China. Well, when you sanction all these countries, if you say to Russia, you cannot trade with anybody in the world, North Korea, you cannot trade with anybody in the world, Iran, you can't, Venezuela, Zimbabwe, China, all these countries, you tell them you can't trade with anybody else in the world. Well, they're not just going to sit there looking at each other going, well, the Americans said I can't trade with anybody else. They're going to start trading with each other. And then those are going to build into military partnerships. So, when Russia needs drones and Iran is sitting on a huge number of drones, or Russia needs artillery shells and North Korea is sitting on a huge number of artillery shells, why wouldn't they sell them to the Russians? Right. And again, this isn't like some fundamental thing where now the North Koreans are going to be best friends with the Russians forever. I don't think that's the case. I think, again, if we, first take the negative pressures off the table, right? Stop threatening to bomb Tehran, stop conducting these bilateral or trilateral war games around the Korean Peninsula. We end the proxy war against Moscow. I think over time, especially, if we're not provoking and stoking these fires, then the issues between China and Russia, the territorial concerns in Russia's east, maybe those start to bubble up to the surface a little bit more. Maybe these, especially look, Putin is, I think, in his late 60s, early 70s now. She is not a young man himself. These leaders may have some personal relationships, but they're not going to be in power forever. Nobody is. And so as time goes on, as these relationships at least cool, then the U.S. could really start to come in, and we could, make a deal with North Korea to start to, de-escalate tensions there. And so all this is probably going to take time. I don't think that this is like a foundational axis of evil, but rather just a practical alliance of countries who have all been targets for decades of the United. Again, this isn't something that happened overnight, right? Like Putin and Xi didn't just become best friends suddenly. It was years and years and rounds of sanctions and tariffs and condemnations and, being insulted and being threatened at the United Nations constantly, that has pushed all these countries together. And again, it's, I think, a very temporary thing. A lot of these, particularly Beijing and Pyongyang, they really don't get along very well if there's not like an aggressive United States agitation, basically making both of them more mad at the United States than they could ever possibly be at each other. And so that I think that's, kind of fundamentally what we're looking at here. I do agree that you're right too, that I should add that, and people are very flippant about this, right? Where if Israel bombs Iran, then Russia is going to get involved, or if the US attacks North Korea, then China is going to invade. I think a lot of these people, Xi, Kim, the Ayatollah, Putin, are either nationalists or they're out for themselves, right? And so if Putin thinks it's beneficial to fight in Syria a little bit, then he will do that. But he's not going to go to an all-out war against Israel. He's allowed Israel. So Russia has backed Syria since 2015. They've had their troops fighting a war in Syria since 2015. And while Israel hasn't bombed Russian troops, they have killed their allies, the Syrian troops that the Russians are allied with, on a weekly basis for 10 years. And the Russians have done nothing about it. You know what I mean? And so, obviously Russia isn't going to rush to war in the Middle East on behalf of Iran, or rush to war in North Korea on behalf of Pyongyang. However, if, incentives are in place where Russia feels like that's the best way that they could benefit themselves in their global standing, then they might do these things. And certainly I think with a lot the way we look at military technology today, if Russia just moves its S-400 missile, their air defense missile systems to Iran, to North Korea, that's going to really change the game for the United States without the US actually having to deploy, or without Russia having to deploy troops to either of those countries. And so, when people ever ask the question of World War III, I it's so hard to actually pin down, because I'll tell people that World War III start date is going to be determined by historians, not by anybody in the moment. And so when historians look back, if this ultimately escalates to a wider global conflict, then the start of World War III, they're probably going to mark down as February 2022. If
Mhm.
this doesn't turn into World War III and it just kind of, the proxy war in Ukraine ends, the fighting in the Middle East fizzles out, we don't end up with a major conflict in the Asia Pacific, then it's not going to be known as World War III. You just, when Putin, or not Putin, well, that's a bad slip up. When Hitler first invaded Poland, right?
Yeah.
People weren't immediately saying, or maybe some people were, but of course, the immediate declaration wasn't, "Oh, we're
World
now
War
in World
II.
War II," right? It's like as the war grows across and spreads across the world, then you can really make that declaration. Although I think it plays out a little bit differently now, right? Where we have dozens of countries effectively fighting in Ukraine, with all the Western countries that are effectively fighting. You have North Korea and Iran backing the Russians to some degree. If you look at Syria, you have like half the world fighting in that country. If you look at the Asia Pacific, the United States is trying to rally every nation, all from India all the way around China to South Korea, in an alliance against Beijing. And so you could certainly see where people who talk about World War III get their ideas from, and how we may look back in 20 years and say, oh yeah, we were living through World War III then.
Mhm. Yeah, and it's like you said, I think it's a lot more nuanced, and I think both Z and Putin both kind of look at what America has done probably over the last like 20, 30 years and thinks like, wow, they have really destroyed their global standing and really drove down their, citizens' basic standard of living. And what did it really gain them? Like it really didn't seem like it benefited Americans a lot. So, like, I think China's more worried about how they can kind of, first of all, keep 1 billion people kind of well off and like satisfied enough that they don't want to overthrow their own government because, they've had, a tumultuous society for the last 20, 30, 40 years. But, they're starting to kind of get on the straight and narrow. So, I'm sure Z's probably thinking about like, let's try to keep this going. We're starting to come up in the world. We're a serious player now. Let's not be expansionist. Let's not be crazy. Let's try to do, basic capitalism all around the world. We don't want to fight wars though. So, now they're starting to realize that the US isn't looking at them eye to eye in this situation. They're saying, no, 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 no. Like the US is saying, we want war. And China's saying, like, look, you guys need to back off of Taiwan because what was it like a couple weeks ago at the G7 summit or whatever it was, where Xi kind of made it clear, like, Taiwan is a red line. You will not go there. And, now I think he's kind of realizing like, oh, like this isn't that good. And then Putin, once again, he's occupied in Ukraine. So why would it make sense for him to go, fight for Iran or Syria? So, is there anything else you kind of want to add what I just said or anything on South Korea?
No, I mean, I think that pretty much covers all my thoughts on the issue.
Cool, cool. Well, you mentioned Syria there a few times. So, Syria is an area that I just have not studied enough or learned about enough. So, maybe let's kind of do like a short summary of what kind of brings us up to Syria before October 7th. Like, what's important about Syria? What are some important conflicts that happened? How does this play in with Israel and all that? And then obviously kind of what's happened recently. So let's kind of go from whenever our, uh, conflict with Syria started up until October 7th in kind of a brief manner.
Yeah, so I mean, really, to understand Syria, we have to go all the way back to the Barack Obama administration and the war in Libya, because it was after that they overthrew Gaddafi in Libya. They were talking about doing the bank shot, which meant that they were going to funnel the weapons and the fighters, Gaddafi's looted weapons, and then the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, or Al Qaeda in Libya, they're going to funnel those fighters from Libya to Syria to basically repeat what they had done in Libya, which is depose a dictator that they wanted to remove, Muammar Gaddafi, who, look, brutal dictator, right? Absolutely. Libya is now a failed state, so it's obviously in a worse off place. But the main problem that the West, with the U.S., France, NATO, Libya is really a NATO war. It's driven by Hillary Clinton and others in the White House as well. But France is a major pusher behind that conflict, and what that's really about is Gaddafi doesn't play enough ball with the West, and they wanted somebody who was more pliable to their needs, and also somebody who wouldn't be able to put up a fight or have a situation in Libya be so that if Israel decides to conduct an ethnic cleansing of Gaza, there's nobody in Tripoli to put up a fight, right? And that's effectively what's gone on in Libya. And so there's an article by Seymour Hersh called The Rat Line. And he goes over all the details about how they're funneling the weapons from Libya to Syria. People may remember Benghazi in the Hillary Clinton kind of scandal there. Of course, the Republicans, for them, the scandal was, you didn't send American troops to Libya fast enough to rescue our ambassador, Chris Stevens, from being lynched by these mob of extremists. And I mean, certainly there's some truth to that, and that is a failure on the Obama administration for allowing their ambassador to get killed. But what was the ambassador doing? He was helping to funnel the weapons from Libya to Syria. And I just picked this up on the Judge Napolitano show this week. Apparently, before that was, while that operation was going on, we had actually tried to freeze some of those, weapons shipments to the jihadists in Syria, and that's when that riot or terrorist attack broke out that ultimately led to the to Chris Stevens, our ambassador there, being killed. And so now we get to Syria, and the U.S. is arming and backing these jihadist groups. Of course, the Arab Spring is going on throughout the Middle East, and so there's an uprising in Egypt, and we end up backing the military dictator General al-Sisi in his claim to power in Cairo. In Yemen, we bat the protesters against Ali Abdullah Saleh, and then Hillary Clinton organizes a one-man election to have Mansour Hadi elected. In Bahrain, we back the monarchy against the people. And so in different places, we take different stances. But generally, there's, popular uprisings going on across the Arab world against these entrenched dictators, some of which are in the Western orbit and some of which aren't. And so the ones who aren't in the Western orbit, they get marched to be disposed. Gaddafi, Bashar al-Assad, Saleh, and those who are within the Western orbit, Bahrain, Sisi, they're protected by their American friends. And so in Syria, we start to bat the opposition. And very early on in the conflict, we have Michael Flynn, who I can't remember his official, he was head of the Defense Intelligence Agency, the DIA at the time. And he wrote a memo that said that this program risks creating an Islamic caliphate in Syria and Iraq, which eventually happens, right? You have the U.S. backing of these rebel groups leads to the rise of ISIS. And so, some of this is unexpected, right? So they shove all these weapons into Syria. A lot of the fighting is done by Al-Qaeda in Syria, or what was rebranded as the Al-Nusra Front. And they're really trying to overthrow and take over Damascus. But then you also have ISIS, and they're looking not necessarily to overthrow, they are, but they're looking to create their Islamic caliphate. And so rather than going just west to Damascus, they also go east and take Mosul and start to move on Baghdad. And that's when the U.S. gets involved, and they start bombing ISIS on the Iraqi side of the border. And that's, kind of the American introduction into the Syrian civil war in a more overt way, right? Like at first, this is covert. This is the CIA. This is a dirty war, right? We're funneling weapons to jihadists. And that's what's going on first. Then once we have this massive rise of ISIS, we start to carry out operations, particularly in Iraq against ISIS. And in fact, Scott Horton would often observe during this time that we have this insane policy where on one side of the Syrian border, we are conducting strikes in favor of the Shia militias against the Islamic State. And on the other side of the Syrian side of the border, we're conducting strikes against the Shia militias because they're on the side of Bashar al-Assad. Assad. And so in Iraq, of course, the Baghdad government is the American government, and so we're supporting it. And in Syria, the government in Damascus is Bashar al-Assad, and so we're trying to overthrow it. And of course, the forces that are trying to overthrow are ISIS is trying to overthrow both countries, but we're only attacking it in one effectively, or at least for a period of time. Eventually, what the U.S. does is it makes common cause with the Syrian Kurds. Initially, it's the YPG, which just is an offshoot of the Turkish PKK, which is even labeled by the United States a terrorist organization. The PKK it's a Turkish insurgency, right? The Turks are impressed the Kurds are impressed in Turkey, and so they fight back, and particularly in the past, and using terrorist style tactics. I'm not sure when the last time the Kurds actually did like a suicide bombing or something like that in Turkey, but they'll shoot up a building or something like that happens. And so to create a amount of obscurity between the United States backing another terrorist group in Syria, a Kurdish terrorist group in Syria, we create what is known as the Syrian Democratic Forces, or the SDF. And these are local Syrian Arabs combined with mostly the YPG, the Syrian Kurds. And we help them take over Syria, effectively all the territory that is east of the Euphrates River. And so the U.S. controls like between a third and a quarter of Syrian territory. Importantly, this territory has a lot of the food production for Syria and almost all the oil production for Syria. So from the United States, holding this territory is fairly lucrative, right? Or at least it prevents money from going to the government of Assad. Now, in 2015, there was a chemical weapons attack, and it was pretty clearly done by the Syrian opposition, the al-Nusra Front. But the West immediately blames it on Bashar al-Assad. And,
Assad's
this is when
people.
Assad gasses his own people. This is when Obama's ramping up for war. We're getting ready to go in. And what Vladimir Putin does is he goes to Bashar al-Assad and he says, give me all of your chemical weapons and we'll destroy them. We'll take this issue off the table for the Americans, and does so. And then Putin also enters the war around that time on behalf of Bashar al-Assad. And look, the rebels, the al-Qaeda rebels, we were very close to having Mohammed al-Jawlani, the leader of the al-Nusra Front, as being the ruler of Damascus back in 2013, 2014. There's a suburb of Damascus, Duma, that in East Ghouta, that these areas were actually controlled by the Syrian rebels at a time. Very close to Damascus. They were shelling Damascus. They were shooting Syrian civilians with sniper fire in Damascus from the territory that they held. And the Russians, along with the Iranians and Hezbollah, really helped the Syrians to drive all these terrorists up to the north in Idlib. And so, I mean, I don't know if you have a map that you could pull up real quick. People, if you can't see Syria, you should just pull up a map because it might help you to understand here. And so what happened is the Al-Qaeda terrorists end up getting pushed to this northern territory of Syria called Idlib. And this northern territory, what happens is Turkey moves their troops in, and effectively, and remember that Turkey is a NATO member state. And so they set up a few dozen outposts around the Syrian Idlib province that effectively prevent the Russians and the Syrian government from moving in and taking that territory and removing, killing al-Jawlani and removing al-Qaeda from this territory. In fact, during this time, our own U.S. government is calling the Idlib province the largest al-Qaeda safe haven, the largest jihadist safe haven in the entire world. The fighters here, by the way, Kyle, they're not just, Syrians who are fighting against and who are jihadists. We're talking about veterans from the Iraq, the Libyan war, but also Uyghurs from China and, other people from Muslims from Central Asia who all came to Syria to get in the fight. And so while largely speaking, they were able to take all the territory from the Islamic State, Idlib remained in the hands of jihadists for years and years and years. And the war essentially turned into a frozen conflict during the Trump administration. I think the only territory that changed hands significantly during the Trump administration the U.S. mopped up some of the ISIS fighters along the Iraq-Syria border on the western side, the western Euphrates side of the river, but also Turkey took some of the territory that was held by our SDF allies right along the Turkish-Syrian border. And so enter Biden administration, not much is said through the first few years here, but then suddenly the rebels, the Al Nusra Front, which is now called HTS or Harir Tahrir al Sham, you just call it HTS, launched this massive offensive and actually took Aleppo and now Hama from the Syrian government. And these are significant Syrian cities that are on the road to Damascus. And so this is a real concern. It seemed really in 2015, 2016, Kyle, that we had reached the point that we could all breathe a sigh of relief that we were not going to have Al Qaeda in charge of Damascus. And now I think that's a real threat again.
Okay, man, that is a lot.
Yeah,
So,
and I guess there's so many other like little things here, like how Israel continues to bomb Syria every single week. And so there's these little sets of Al Qaeda fighters in the Syrian steppe that are able to constantly come and, they'll blow up a bus of Syrian soldiers. They'll shoot up a bus of Syrian soldiers. They'll kill some civilians or just so many of these little things, or that the U.S. has a very small base along the Syrian Jordanian border called Al Tanaf. And they like draw a circle around this border and they bomb Syrian troops every time they, try to come into this area, even if they're chasing jihadist or ISIS fighters through the area. And so, it's pretty clear here, Kyle, that the U.S. order of priority in Syria is number one, no matter what else is said, depose Bashar al-Assad. Right? That's our number one goal in Syria. And if that means aligning effectively with Al Qaeda, our government is willing to do that. And think about this, right? The only people in the world who actually pose any threat to any American citizens, people coming from abroad and killing Americans, it's not the Iranians, it's not the North Koreans, it's not the Chinese, and it's not the Russians. It's the Al Qaeda terrorists who are the people who they go and shoot up concerts that little girls go to. They knock down our towers in New York City. They drive trucks through crowds full of people, right? Like these are people that our government should actually be concerned about. We should have never allowed the Al Qaeda safe haven in Idlib to fester for 5 years. That's where al Baghdadi was, the leader of ISIS. When we finally killed him, he was hiding out in Idlib with the Al Qaeda guys. That should have been a massive sign right there that we had to do something to mop up these operations, bring the Syrian war to an end, and kill the terrorists while they were all compiled in Idlib. And now we've allowed them to fester and break back out. And just this week, not only are the Al Qaeda guys on an offensive, but we have our SDF, our Syrian Kurdish allies, on an offensive, attacking Assad from the other flank. And so, think about it, you're splitting resources that are already depleted. Also, one of Assad's main ground fighting groups was Hezbollah. And so a lot of their forces have been either snuffed out by the Israelis or redirected to Lebanon to fight against Israel there. And so with that, I'm sure he's very tight on forces. And so when the Americans are encouraging their allies to attack Syrian government positions, well, that creates more problems for Assad. And then when they fight back against the Syrians, then the Americans bomb the Syrian, when the Syrian army forces, Assad's forces, fight back against the Syrian Kurdish forces, then the Americans start bombing the Syrian army, right? Because they're attacking our allies, which we told. And so this is all just, Syria has always been a gigantic, huge mess, and it's only gotten worse with time.
Yeah. So one thing that I kind of wanted to touch on there as well is just how much Israel has really gone after Syria. I mean, they disable their airports frequently. If I remember correctly, they bomb their hospitals. And then, I think this is where people kind of get paranoid to a point we were kind of talking about earlier, where, like you said, Russia is backing Bashar al-Assad to some degree. I think it's where people kind of get worried that, oh, well, we're arming Israel to the teeth. We also bomb Syria. So, what if there are Russian mercenaries that kind of get caught up in all this disaster between Israel and, Syria? Does that implicate the US? Because I think most people would recognize that the US is willing to do whatever Israel says, or basically, if Israel says jump, the US will ask how high.
Well, I mean, there's been a couple. It, Syria is a concern for Russia.
Yeah.
It's not that far, and they are concerned about it being jihadist safe haven.
Mhm.
I think that's a legitimate concern that Russia has in Syria. They also have their only base on the Mediterranean Sea in Syria, and they have a long-standing relationship not just with Bashar al-Assad, but with the Assad family. And so I think Russia will take some pretty extreme steps to try to keep Bashar al Assad from falling. At the same time, during the Trump administration, the US bombed a bunch of Wagner, the Russian mercenary group. We bombed
Yeah.
and killed, Trump said, 3, 4, 500 of their mercenaries that we killed in Syria. In, I want to say, 2015, Turkey shot down a Russian jet that was flying in Syria along the Syrian-Turkish border. I think at least one of the pilots was killed by the jihadists who captured him. And then Israel actually orchestrated and so I can't remember exactly when this was. I'm pretty sure it was during the Trump administration, but might have been at the tail end of Obama. And Russia was getting really tired of Syria conducting these frequent strikes against Assad. And so they apparently let the Syrian government use one of the S-300 systems that they had transferred to Assad to try to shoot down, I want to say it was an Israeli F-15. And the Israeli F-15 effectively used a Russian surveillance plane as a pick and got the Russian surveillance plane shot down. It killed maybe 8 or 13 Russians by this maneuver. And again, the Russians just, more or less took it on the chin. There wasn't a major bombing of Israel or anything like that. They may step up their support for Assad, but it's not like we see, U.S.-Russia war after Turkey shut down a Russian plane over Syria. And so there's always a possibility that we're going to see an escalation. And who knows, Kyle, maybe Russia, Putin calculates that for the U.S., their priority is Israel, Ukraine. And so if that's their priority, if Russia maybe feels like they put more pressure on Israel, then US will divert more of the resources there, and Ukraine will be deprived of some resources. And so maybe there are calculations where Putin really decides to ramp up the war in Syria, particularly trying to drag our target Israel in that conflict, not only to protect Assad, but I think there has to be some direct benefit for the Russians beyond just protecting Assad. There has to be some other things that is really important to Russia for them to significantly increase their role in the Syrian war. Right now, I think the Russians are just basically going to be willing to bomb and fairly indiscriminately. I don't think they have a whole lot of planes, troops, ammunition there, but they will try to bomb the jihadist forces to prevent them from taking Damascus.
Yeah, and I think that kind of circles back to the conversation we were having earlier about how people kind of view basically like the BRICS nations, although I know Syria isn't necessarily in BRICS. They are obviously aligned with Russia to a degree. Like you said, it's more out of like almost necessity where they're like, hey, we've been so screwed by the West that like we have to look to these other countries, Venezuela, Russia, Iran, China, and all these countries that we kind of have to make our own way because the US has just sanctioned the ever living shit out of us. So we kind of have to pave our own way here. And that's something I really haven't thought about, where you kind of mentioned that like Russia may see it in their interest potentially to kind of, get Israel going more after Syria, so that way they kind of take their eye off the target on Ukraine. And unfortunately, I think with the coming Trump administration, um, I've talked with Carl Zaw about this, and him and I are of the mind that I think Ukraine isn't going to get solved. I think it's going to be more of a frozen conflict where they still send some aid, some weapons and stuff, but it's not, to the same fervor that the Biden administration has. But when it comes to Iran, I mean, it's not looking good. I threw out a tweet earlier about how, with all this focus on Iran, that when they release the Epstein files, if they do, then it's going to be all about, how the Epstein, certain kind of ring is going to be an Iranian ring. It's not going to be an Israeli ring. So, yeah.
just like the Trump assassinations.
Oh yeah, it was all
So
Iranians.
I will say on Ukraine, I suspect that the Americans may keep the Ukrainians fighting until their military completely collapses. And then you really don't have an opportunity for a frozen
Sure.
conflict. Russia will essentially extract the terms they want from the Ukrainians at the barrel of a gun at a negotiating table, right?
Yeah.
With Iran, my kind of positive view there is the Iranians really don't seem to want to fight. Right. They
Right.
have a lot of nuclear facilities. They have, Tehran's a fairly modern city. They have fairly good medicine in Iran. The Iranians don't want to, be turned into Libya, right? They don't want their country to end up like Yemen. And so, how, I guess, other than something that directly threatens the Iranian homeland, which, is a pretty far bridge for the Americans to cross. I think the Iranians will go to pretty extensive lengths to try to avoid a direct war with the West. I think now our real concern has to be the fall of Syria. I mean that will be an absolute disaster. I mean, you want to talk about creating the grounds to see a resurgence of ISIS, and you'll have Al Qaeda effectively in charge of a state. I mean, this is a real disaster to worry about here. And what will the Russians do to try to prevent the fall of Assad? How much do the Russians feel like the Americans help the jihadists, and how do they respond? Because so there's, I think, so many questions surrounding Syria right now. I will say the one little bit of good news is that Tulsi Gabbard is going to be the DNI, and the best thing that she has ever been on is the war in Syria, right? She hates with the passion, and it's because she worked in a medical unit, and she understands that the people who killed our boys and girls over in the Middle East were the jihadists, right? Like, those are our enemies, are the jihadists. We have to deal with the jihadists. And her solutions to this, like waging drone wars and things like that, I don't agree with. However, if we are going to take sides in Syria, there is 1,000% reason to take the side of Bashar al-Assad over the jihadists. It's not even a close comparison for any American, right? And so to have Tulsi Gabbard in a significant position in the administration may be very, very meaningful if we are talking about in a few months here, Assad, really having his rule threatened, America pulling the plug on the dirty war, pulling the plug on the Turks' support for al-Jawlani and his band of jihadists could be extremely important. And so that is like I always am trying to look for the silver linings, especially when it comes to Trump. I don't think there's any reason to just be super negative, because you really don't know what's going to happen.
Sure.
And so rather than being negative and sounding like an alarmist, I try to look for the bright spots. And I think, Tulsi Gabbard, especially with, this was completely unexpected. We had no idea on election day that Syria was going to be an issue. I mean, people thought this was going to be essentially a frozen conflict forever, right? Like the battle lines weren't changing. Nobody expected this offensive from the Syrian rebels. And so now that this has happened, I'm very grateful that Tulsi Gabbard is going to be in the incoming administration.
Yeah, that's something that I haven't really considered or ever heard of. And I think, as I've said on multiple shows now, that you kind of have to grade the Trump picks on a Trump curve, as in, like, who that he could pick, that he would pick, is going to be good for this job. And, like you said, Tulsi Gabbard, despite the fact that she's a self proclaimed hawk on terror, when you compare it to everybody else, she's about as good as you're going to get for a Trump administration, which, once again, not our ideal pick. But Trump, it's about, like I said, it's as good as it's going to get. Marco Rubio and Mike Waltz, those are about, I said it, and maybe some people did give me shit for it, but I think Anthony Blinken and Marco Rubio, Marco Rubio might be worse than Anthony Blinken. But once again, the people surrounding Marco Rubio are better than Lloyd Austin and Jake Sullivan. So maybe there's some hope there. I don't know. But is there anything you want to reply to there? I got a couple more questions if you got time.
Not really. I'll just say I have been pushing, and not just insignificantly. We've made a little bit of progress behind the scenes getting his name to the Trump team. We've really been pushing for making Joe Twillinger
Mhm.
the envoy to North Korea, which I think would be the way to actually get something done there.
Yeah, absolutely. And if that is to happen, I know we've talked about this kind of in private too. I think that would probably be something that would almost make me regret not voting for Trump, is if he
Agree.
were to appoint someone like Joe into that, because I think that could do a lot to cool off tensions over in that region. And that is like, obviously me, you, Connor, Dave DeCamp. Our main concern is the hot war with China that, everybody just seems so gung ho about. So, Joe in that position that at least cools off one major head where that could really pop off, which, like you said, is North Korea. So, one kind of other through line that I'm thinking of, when you were mentioning kind of how Syria and Iran kind of looks at a lot of stuff, is that kind of like our main enemies foreign policy wise when we're looking from the US administration, Iran, China, and Russia. Their foreign policy generally seems to be characterized by one thing, and that's restraint. Especially Iran, they have demonstrated for years now just the utmost restraint. Where I think back to when Biden got elected, where they were like, "All right, can you guys re-enter the nuclear deal?" No, and then they're like, "All right, well, can you just say you're gonna enter the nuclear deal and we'll do everything you want?" And they're like, "No. Like, can you please just kind of give us some kind of sign here? Like, we want to work with you any way we can to get sanctions relief. And whatever you guys want, we're gonna do." And the US just says no. And then what happens? They're like, "Oh no, Iran's doing all these irrational things. They're the world sponsor of terrorism." But Iran just continues to just anything to get anybody to the negotiating table. And it seems like Putin, same deal, where even in the interview with Tucker, he constantly said everything the US did was a mistake. He never said it was a provocation. He always said it was a mistake. And then Xi kind of looks at all of the stuff with Taiwan. It seems like he's kind of changed his tune a little bit, but he's kind of like, won't circle the island, but like, we still respect the United States and their standing in the world. We don't want war, but we need you guys to lay off Taiwan. So those three there, it just seems like they're really restrained in how they react to what the US does.
Yeah, and look, this isn't because the Ayatollah or Putin or Xi are superior to American politics. Well, they may be a little bit, at least our current crop of politicians. But
Sure.
the Iranians, the Chinese, the Russians, they don't have any special secret that makes them better people than us Americans or have better politicians than us Americans. It's really just because they need to show restraint, right? Like if Iran and the U.S. went to war, like me and you would probably live through the war, but 30-year-old men in Iran would not, right?
Mhm.
Like let's just be honest, like Russia and China, we're talking about nuclear war there. So there's a level of mutually assured destruction or something
Right.
like,
It's a
but
different
I think
calculus.
effectively these countries almost have to show restraint because we are the most powerful country in the world. And so, it's very easy to show restraint when the person that you would be fighting against is clearly a bigger and tougher man than you are. Like,
Mhm.
yeah, it's easy to show restraint. I'm not sure. Like, if had Russia won the Cold War and Vladimir Putin, was essentially sitting on top of Moscow's unipolar moment for the past 2 decades, he may have waged a bunch of stupid wars in the Middle East and fucked up the whole world. But that's not the reality that we lived in. It was the Americans that did that. And so we've had to show absolutely no restraint, and we haven't. Other countries have had to for their own self preservation, and they did.
Right. All right. Well, I think that kind of wraps up everything I kind of wanted to cover today. Kyle, this is very, very informative.
Can
Is
I
there
mention one more thing that you
Yeah, go
had
ahead. Go
said
ahead.
that so you were talking about Syria, you had mentioned that Israel had bombed Syrian airports, and
Yeah.
that's correct. I just wanted to add one more thing that the US and Israel were doing to Syria. The US has put sanctions on Syria. They're called the Caesar sanctions. They're
Yes.
from this guy who claimed to smuggle photos out of Syria that showed a whole bunch of abuse. People looked at the
Mhm.
photos and they said that most of the photos were of dead Syrian troops, meaning Assad didn't kill his own forces. They were killed by the enemy. And so it didn't show what they had claimed to show. But we have what are designed to be crippling economic sanctions on Syria. And we didn't lift those even after there was that major earthquake along the Turkish-Syrian border a few years ago. People
Yeah.
were really suffering and dying through the COVID pandemic lockdowns. There was no sanctions relief. But
Right.
also after that earthquake happened, Israel bombed and shut down the nearest Syrian airport to the
Right.
area. Right. So
Mhm.
they were explicitly preventing aid from getting to the people who had just were buried under rubble from an earthquake. And
Mhm.
Israel was bombing the Syrian airport. And so, yeah, it's just I just wanted to highlight how extreme the Western Israeli policy is in Syria.
Yeah, I completely forgot about that until you mentioned it. That was about 2 years ago, if I remember correctly, 2 or 3 years ago. I remember all about that. I wanna say that was when Dave, DeCamp started his show because I remember him talking about that, and if I remember correctly, I think Matt Gaetz was lobbying to pull troops out of Syria, but, I think he voted to leave sanctions on Syria when all this stuff happened, and I don't chalk that up to him saying, "Oh, fuck the Syrians." I think it was just more of like he probably got bad intel from his staffers because Matt Gaetz, which it's kind of a tragedy that he's not going to be back in Congress or the House of Representatives. But he kind of did have some good foreign policy takes on the Middle East. Obviously he wasn't good on Israel, but he was at least good. Mar-
Somalia, nobody in Congress has been better on Somalia than Matt Gaetz.
yes.
Even even Ilhan Omar hasn't been as a vocal defender of trying to get the U.S. to
Mhm.
end its dirty war and bombing campaigns and
Yeah.
occupation and all the other nefarious things that we're doing in Somalia.
Right.
Matt Gaetz has been on top of that. And Syria has probably been his like number 2 issue in the Middle East. So yeah, that's
Mhm.
another big loss, kind of going into what we're looking at now that he's not going to be in Congress or the administration.
Yeah, real quick, B. I've heard people make this point, and Kyle, you can kind of touch on it as well. But Matt Gaetz was played by Trump. He was anti-APAC. Matt Gaetz may have never received any money from APAC, but make no mistake, he took trips over to Israel. He supported anti-BDS laws in Florida dating back to 2019. He is a huge, 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 huge Zionist. He loves Bibi, and he supported lots of aid to Israel. And I don't want this to sound like I'm coming down on you, but I've seen people peddle this narrative that just because he never received money from APAC, that's the reason why he was thrown out of the administration. He's as Zionist as they come. And once again, if you look through his timeline, I mean, if I remember correctly, I think his wife has Jewish family. Not that this compromised him technically, but like he supported a lot of measures that would go to support Israel. And once again, even supporting the strictest, and he said himself, I'm proud to represent a state in Florida that has the strictest anti-BDS laws in the entire country. So to act like this was some kind of Israeli hit job, I just think that's complete total bullshit. Kyle, if there's anything you want to add there, go ahead.
Yeah, I don't I don't think I have I think you did a pretty good job of covering it. I just agree with you that Gates isn't for he kind of like Tulsi Gabbard, right? Like
Right.
he doesn't want to fight the wars for the jihadists. Now, what he doesn't realize, of course, is Israel's grand scheme in the Middle East, and this is something that I've been talking about a lot since October 7th. If you look at the Middle East right now, any state that could stand up to what Israel is doing to the Palestinians is either Iran or has been destroyed or has been
Mhm.
bought off. So Iraq destroyed, Syria destroyed, Libya destroyed, Sudan destroyed, Somalia destroyed, Jordan, Egypt, Saudi, Qatar, Emirates, all paid for. And
Right.
so Yemen destroyed, another one on the list. And
Yeah.
so if you look around the Middle East, everybody who could stand up to Israel has been completely either placated or just annihilated. And that's a big part of what's going on here. And so, it's good that Gates is willing to stand up on these issues. And I'm glad he is. And that's why if, he was still in the running to be attorney general, I would be applauding it. I know he's a Zionist. I know he's going to have bad takes on some issues dealing with the free speech of Americans, even potentially myself, trying to speak out in favor of, the Palestinians not being the victims of a U.S. backed Israeli genocide. that may be a setback when you have somebody like Gates or Tulsi Gabbard in the administration. At the same time, at least they have some reasonable policy issues on some issues, right? Like we're not going to get Ron Paul in the administration. We're not going to get Scott Horton in the administration. Hell, we're not even going to ever have like John Mearsheimer in the administration. But Tulsi Gabbard isn't that bad. Matt Gaetz wouldn't have been that bad on a lot of issues.
Yeah, I agree. And Matt Gaetz is one of the people that I really applauded for his being in as AG. And it's very unfortunate that, like I said, he's not choosing to take his seat back. He could still technically, but it doesn't seem like he has any interest in doing that. And I laid this out in other shows before. I think he just realized that it would have took Trump a lot of political capital. And I think he decided that like this isn't how I want Trump to spend his political capital. So I'll step down and kind of take the hit and just kind of save them the trouble of doing that, which I think is admirable, but it is unfortunate nonetheless. And for my other guitar player in a common crown, Kyle Anzalone, a lot of great info tonight.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Kyle, go ahead. If you all got anything else, give your plugs and we'll close this one out.
Yeah, really the main thing I want to plug is the Kyle Anzalone show. It's my brand new show. I've been doing conflicts of interest for several years. That's my main show. And I now have a producer who's helping me put together and really put out a high quality show where I'm going over these topics. I have like clips and maps and articles and just all kinds of stuff popping up on the screen to really help people to know what's happening and to understand the stories. And so I'm really happy. I've done 3 episodes of it now. I think it keeps getting better. It's always when you do like new things in the podcasting world, it always takes like a couple times to get used to, especially after doing over 700 episodes of the Conflicts of Interest show. But it's coming along, so subscribe to it because we're going to be doing great things on that channel. And of course, read the Libertarian Institute, where I'm the news editor, and antiwar.com, where I am the opinion editor.
Yeah, absolutely. And those are 2 resources that anybody who's listening to this channel should use to the best of their ability and donate to if you financially can afford it. And if you can financially afford that and you have a little bit of extra change, feel free to become a channel member here for $2.99 a month. And as Kyle said, make sure you go over and subscribe to his channel so that way he can kind of offer all the same stuff to his subscribers and listeners. And I am one of those people because, Kyle puts out a lot of great information. And as I said in the introduction to the show, I'm going to have to list this one over again because there was just a lot of really good info here. So, Kyle, thank you for coming on. And we'll definitely do it again soon, man. Thank you.
Sounds good. Thanks for having me again, Kyle.
Of course. All right, everybody. Take care and good night.